time the wee hours of the morning had come. I was flat broke. I had a wife who thought I was an idiot. I had probably ruined my Christian testimony in the emergency room, and on top of that, I still didn't have a sermon for a worship hour that was fast approaching. I had gone way beyond mad to utter exasperation. I had never before felt so sorry for myself. I was throwing a pity party like you would not believe. And then it occurred to me in those early morning hours that what I really needed to do was start over. What I really needed more than anything else was somehow to rewind. What I really wish I could have done was to begin again. Now, probably none of you have ever been there. Probably none of you have no idea what I'm talking about. But for me, there have been those days or nights or situations, and you're just not sure how it all happens, but somehow you get there, and in the deepest part of your being, you just want to start over. That's what happened to ancient King David when he got involved with Bathsheba. He was where he was not supposed to be. He was doing what he had no business doing, and everything was going all right for a while. But then that moment came when life tumbled in and unraveled. Bathsheba had gotten pregnant by David, who then sent her husband Uriah to the fiercest part of Israel's latest war, hoping that he would be killed, and he in fact was killed. Bathsheba gave birth to a son who soon after fell sick and died. And if that weren't enough, the prophet Nathan exposed David's behavior for the world to see. And here we are thousands of years later still rehearsing that event. And don't you think David would like to have turned the clock back so he could start over? Don't you think that David, more than anything else in the world, just wanted to rewind that stretch of his life and start again at point A? When I think of folks who have gotten into such big messes that they want to start over, I cannot help but think of the Apostle Peter. On the night before Jesus was crucified, Peter swore his allegiance to Jesus and his cause. In Mark chapter 11, verse 29, Peter said, "Even though all may fall away, I will not." Then 2 verses later, Peter declared rather belligerently, "Even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you." Put 2 or 3 exclamation points after that statement. In Luke's gospel, Peter says it like this: "Lord, with you I am ready to go both to prison and to death." And I like Peter's spunk, don't you? But before the dawn broke the next morning, Peter denied Jesus 3 times. 3 times. It was a complete denial. It was an utter denial. Not just before those who had the power to take Peter's life, but before a little frail servant girl who could have been crushed beneath Peter's thumb. So much for tough guys and tough talk. At the conclusion of that 3rd denial, the Bible tells us that while Peter was still in the throes of denial, a rooster crowed. Luke tells it like this: "Then the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had told him, 'Before a rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times.'" The next verse says that Peter went out and he wept bitterly. I think about Peter and I imagine him weeping from the deepest part of his soul and crying out, "If I could just start over, if I could just rewind this entire night, if somehow I could just begin once more." Have you ever considered the story of the woman caught in the very throes of adultery? Her story is found in John's 8th chapter. The Bible tells us that it was early morning. Jesus had already arrived at the temple, and he was teaching whoever had come that day. Suddenly, some of the good and righteous religious folks dragged a woman right into the middle of that teaching session. Since it was early morning, they had likely just pulled her out of some man's bed where she had spent the night. This was no prostitute committing fornication. This was a married woman committing adultery. I've always wondered where the man happened to be, but there is no mention of him, only her. She was standing at center court, surrounded by this huge crowd of people, probably wrapped in nothing more than a bedsheet, and she is being relentlessly taunted, viciously accused. If you can somehow imagine, put yourself in her place, how would you feel? Would you not in those moments be wishing in the deepest part of your being that you could start over, that you could rewind, that you could begin again, desperately longing to go back and start once more? Well, let's take this idea all the way back to Jonah, who had messed up big time. It would have been all right with him if God had just taken his life. I imagine that David felt that way. I imagine that Peter felt that way. I imagine that the woman who had been dragged out of bed and compelled into that temple court felt that way. God, just kill me now. It would have been all right with Jonah if God had just taken his life, but God did not take his life. Instead, Jonah found himself tossed by this horrific storm. He found himself humiliated before a group of pagan men who saw him as a hypocrite. He found himself thrown into the sea where some kind of gigantic mutated fish just sucked him right down its throat. Instead of death, Jonah found himself sitting in the stench of a fish's belly, his head and shoulders wrapped in seaweed, his skin shriveled like a prune, and his stomach deathly nauseated from the endless tossing of that fish in the current of the ocean. Don't you think that Jonah wanted to start over? Don't you think that Jonah wanted to begin again? Don't you think that Jonah, if somehow he could have made it happen, he would have gone back to that day when God said, Jonah, arise, go to Nineveh, the great city, and cry against it. Don't you think Jonah wishes he could have gone back to that day? And don't you think he desperately longed to rewind? And don't you think that with all of his strength and with all of his might, Jonah dreamed of a second chance? And then it happened. Verse 1, chapter 3. The word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time. Do you know what I think? I think Jonah chapter 3, verse 1 records the greatest miracle in the entire book. The greatest miracle is not the raising of the storm. The greatest miracle is not the calming of the storm. The greatest miracle is not the design of the fish. The greatest miracle to be found in Jonah's story is that the word of the Lord came to this man a second time. The miracle of this epic is that God gave Jonah a second chance. Now that shouldn't surprise us, but it does. Why? Well, because most of us have yet to understand that second chances are all over the Bible. In the wake of David's adultery, Nathan the prophet said to David, the Lord has taken away your sin, you shall not die. David should have died. That's what the law required, but God took away David's sins. Yes, there were consequences that trailed David for the rest of his life, but God took away that sin. God gave him a second chance. And what about Peter, who denied the Lord with everything he could muster, who swore in denying him, and then wept in bitter shame and humiliation? 3 times Peter said, I do not know him. I do not know him. Blankety, blankety, blank, I do not know him. A few days later, Jesus said to Peter, shepherd my sheep. In fact, Jesus said to Peter 3 different times, shepherd my sheep. Peter denied the Lord 3 times. 3 times Jesus said to Peter, shepherd my sheep. Wouldn't it have been better if Peter had never denied the Lord? Of course it would have been. But that's not the point. The point is that Peter got a second chance. The point is that Peter got to start over. The point is that Peter got to rewind, so to speak, and start again. And what about the woman dragged out of bed and taken to center court in that temple? Jesus said to her, I do not condemn you. Now go and sin no more. Talk about release from the past. There's no greater picture in all the Word of God than that. If Jonah's story teaches us anything, it teaches us that God is the God of the second chance. And you may be wondering, what if I've had a second chance? And what if I've blown that? And what if I've had a 3rd chance and I've blown that? And what if I've had a 4th chance and I've blown that? And what if I've had a 5th chance and I've blown that? What then? The closing chapter of 2 Chronicles records the story of Jerusalem's final demise at the hands of a foreign military power. Listen to a few verses here. Zedekiah, the king of Judah. Zedekiah did evil in the sight of the Lord his God. He did not humble himself before Jeremiah the prophet who spoke for the Lord. He stiffened his neck and hardened his heart against turning to the Lord God of Israel. Furthermore, all the officials of the priests and the people were very unfaithful, following all the abominations of the nations, and they defiled the house of the Lord, which he had sanctified in Jerusalem. The Lord sent word to them again and again by his messengers, because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they continually mocked the messengers of God, despised his words, and scoffed at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord rose against his people, until there was no remedy. There are 3 things I want you to see out of those verses. Here's the first. There can come that point where there is no remedy. It is possible to refuse God and refuse God and refuse God and refuse God and refuse God. It is possible to cross a line from which you will have no opportunity to make things right. That is a possibility. The second thing I want you to see here is that God sent messengers to Judah, not just once, not just twice, but he sent messengers again and again and again. Very much like the stories that Jesus told in the Gospels of a king turning over his land, or a business owner turning over his land to his employers or to his slaves. And then later sending messenger after messenger after messenger after messenger. All of them treated shabbily and poorly, until at last he sent his own son, whom they killed. But God sent them messengers again and again and again. He kept trying to reach them, just as perhaps he is trying to reach you again and again. Here's the third thing I see in these verses. If there is a breath in your body and you desperately want to start over, then most likely God is offering you a second chance or a third chance or a fourth chance or a fifth chance today. Why not begin again? Why not rewind right now? Why not start over today? Now let me give you some good news and then let me give you some better news. The good news is that the greatest miracle in Jonah is that God gave him a second chance. The better news is that the greatest miracle wrought by God in Jonah is for you. A man was passing through town, another state, another city, another church. Had not seen him in quite some time. He was passing through town. He gave me a call. He invited me to have lunch with him that day. His words, for some reason, he just knew that he was supposed to spend time with me on that day. Sounds more like a glutton for punishment, but that's what he said. So I joined him for lunch. As we talked, he began to tell me about his first divorce. He was unfaithful to his wife. She eventually left him. He finally got his life together. He got his life straightened out, and he married again. Over time, however, this man's business became his God. And instead of tending to his wife, he tended to his business 24/7. And that eventually destroyed his second marriage. And as I sat that day listening to this man, I could tell that he really wanted to be used by God. But he looked at his past. He looked at his failures. And he saw nothing but a mess. And he knew that he was responsible for that mess. He didn't try to put it on anybody else. He put it squarely on his shoulders. He wanted to be used by God, but he'd made a mess of his life. And I think he had truly been questioning, not would God use him, but that even God loved him, that even God would want him. Well, I had the opportunity that day to encourage this man with the greatest miracle in Jonah's story. The word of the Lord came to Jonah the second time. Say that with me. The word of the Lord came to Jonah the second time. Say that again. The word of the Lord came to Jonah the second time. Let me tell you what I believe. I believe that miracle is yours. And I believe that miracle is yours today. I believe that miracle is yours right now. Many years ago in Billy Graham's Decision magazine, the editor included a poem written by Evelyn Bentz, and this is how it goes. The birds' nests that cradled last year's young sit empty, weather-worn like falling barns. The robins return, ignore the rubble, and start over. They build with a vigor that puts me to shame. Teach me their secret, Lord. I want to look forward, always forward. I want to look toward the fresh. I want to look toward the new. The first time I read that poem, I thought to myself, That's a picture of me. That's a picture of us. That is the picture of our lives when we feel like nothing more than an old robin's nest that has been abandoned and left forlorn and forsaken. But then God comes like a robin. And He forgives the rubble. And He takes what was once a life that had been teeming with activity, teeming with productivity, teeming with fruitfulness, but had gone silent. He takes that life, He takes that nest, and He begins again. And once again there is life. And once again there is activity. And once again there is newness. And once again there is freshness. And once again, productivity. God comes like the robin. Even in nature, we see that God is the God of the second chance. If you are like me, you need God to come like the robin. You have needed God to come like the robin in the past. And some of us need God to come like the robin today. And for sure, one such as I will need God to come like the robin in the future. Are you tired of sitting in the stench of the fish's belly with seaweed wrapped around your head and your shoulders, nauseated by the rocky ride of your life? Doesn't have to be that way. The Word of God comes to you today. For some of us, maybe it's the second time. But for others of us, maybe it's the third or the fourth or the fifth. Someone said to me after the early service today, for her, God had come the 100th time. What's going on in your life today? God will come like the robin if you let Him, if you trust Him. If you've never come to faith in Jesus Christ, that's the starting point. And in just a few moments, we're going to have what we call a song of invitation, where you're invited to come forward, kneel in this altar and pray. Talk to the Lord about whatever He is addressing in your heart. Or to take my hand and just say, Connell, I need Jesus Christ in my heart. I want to invite Christ into my life. Maybe that's where you are. Would love to introduce you to Jesus Christ. Maybe you're looking for a church home. We've really got a good one here. And we're grateful to the Lord. And because we are folks who need God to come like a robin, you're going to find that kind of God here. Doesn't matter where you've been, how long you've been there, what you've done. God comes like the robin. And in His name and by His authority, we offer that to you today. And maybe you want to come and join with us here. You can attend until the second advent and never join. But maybe God's calling you to do that. We want you to come today. What's the Lord telling you? Don't resist Him. Don't put it off any longer. Just obey Him. As the word of the Lord comes to you today, just obey Him. Let's pray. Father, I just sense that you were doing a great work in this place today. That there are men and women, there are teenagers, even children who are here, part of this worship event, to whom you are reaching out, to whom your word has come yet again, and you're calling. Come. 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 Give me that broken down nest, and I'll rebuild. Start over. Rewind. Begin once more. Father, continue to transform us and make us into the men and women you want us to be. And like Jonah today, we come to the greatest miracle of all. Your word has come to us yet again. And we come to you accepting your offer of renewal, of refreshment, of restoration, of being used.